Thank you for coming out this morning. So as many of you know, battles over privacy are absolutely raging. Congress is considering different kinds of new regulation, trying to figure out what to do, right? The FTC is trying to reconsider its own acts. State legislators are having a field day trying to imagine what we should think of when we think of privacy. Across the pond in Europe, we see regulators trying to imagine the notion of forgetting, trying to obliterate the ability to remember within the internet world. And we see all of these battles playing out as lawyers and computer scientists, consumer advocates, and policymakers try to grok what privacy means and what it really should mean in an era of social media. And yet, no one can actually agree on what privacy is or what it means to actually protect it in the first place. In listening to the different rhetorics that I keep hearing, I'm really fascinated by the individual-centric nature of privacy in a networked era. It seems rather ironic, right? Because as we think about, privacy, we keep thinking going back to individual and the notion of individual harm. In some sense, it makes sense, right? Lawyers are involved. Whenever we get lawyers, it means individual harm. But we also have to sort of deal with the ideas of neoliberalism and how neoliberalism is affecting our ideas of individual. At the same time, we have to think about libertarianism, all of which feeds into the tech industry, all of which is part of what we're seeing today. But what we're really missing is actually a theory or a conceptualization of what networked privacy looks like, what it means that we're all sort of connected in weird ways. Because Facebook and Twitter and blogs and social media have very much ushered in a networked era. We're all connected, our data is connected, our interactions are connected, and our privacy is connected. When Mark Pesce's mother decided to put up a public page of her family's genealogy, she was displaying something that was of great importance to her, something that was deeply personal. But not only did she reveal all sorts of information about her personally, she also managed to reveal the mother's maiden name of pretty much everybody in her family, right? She ended up giving away the information to the #1 security question on the internet, right? All because she was trying to think about a way of displaying herself and caring. Right? When mommy bloggers sit there and put up funny pictures that they think are really cute about their kids, right, they're suddenly revealing all sorts of information about them that will embarrass them for the rest of their lives, right? And it's really ironic considering that mothers are one of the big groups out there saying, kids, privacy, we care about it, and yet they themselves are doing more revealing than the kids are themselves. And of course, when your friends from high school scan and upload photos that they think are really funny onto Facebook, things that were happening maybe 20 years ago, it may not have quite the level of humor that you think it is now, especially if you're running for office, right? And so politicians may complain about privacy invasions for themselves, but yet at the same time, there's also this really funny game where they themselves are invading privacy of all sorts of people. We have this sort of really interesting moment with targeted marketing in particular, where we see all of these laws coming into being to sort of protect against targeted marketing when politicians themselves are trying to find ways to fundraise and market and attract voters using the same techniques. Keep in mind that every coin we see in the privacy era is very much two-sided. What we're seeing with data mining services is we're starting to construct really odd portraits about people, portraits that we say are the really idealized or perfect self. But we're not really thinking about the ways in which this is really reflecting a very peculiar idea of society. It's no longer just everything that you do that goes down on your permanent record, but rather everything that everyone does that concerns you, implicates you, or might even influence you is going to go down on your public record. And we have to actually think about the ways in which we are very much connected in this networked world. Because the people doing the watching are very much a part of the process. It's not really that we can untangle and think about the individual in this space. We very much have to think about it as the collection of these networks. And so if we want to actually have privacy in this networked world, we need to actually think through what that networked privacy means. Now, there are a lot of different ways to slice and dice what privacy means, and I'm not going to be able to give you a clean definition. But I actually want you to really think about two of the most important factors to privacy that I deal with whenever I think about young people. Two factors that we often really forget that are actually at the core of privacy and the actual actions of privacy. And that has to do with the notions of control and the notions of agency. But it's not just control over information that matters. It's control over a social situation. And it's not just agency that matters. It's agency to assert control in a social situation. So control over a social situation is the ability not just to control the particular technology. In fact, controlling of Facebook gets you nowhere. It's about being able to say that you control what the norms are, what the values are, how we understand a social situation. And you'll be able to actually control how information flows, not simply because of what's technologically possible, but because of what's socially viable, what makes sense in the particular environments. And we do this all the time in really interesting ways in places that we would think of as public. Right, the ability to lean over and whisper to somebody in this room, which is a way in which you use your voice to control the social situation. And you signal to that person in the process of whispering that this is to actually be maintained really, really tightly. Secondly, you have this notion of agency, and agency is actually a much more tricky issue. Agency is the freedom that people have to make their own choices without being constrained by the structural factors. Right, the ability to actually come out and speak and actually say, I'm whispering to you and you need to pay attention to me. And agency is about the moment in which you can say, hey, if you don't pay attention to this, there are social costs for it. Privacy isn't simply about restricting access to information. It's about having that moment of control and agency. And when we take away agency from people, especially young people, and we tell them that their only form of control is technological, they can't actually achieve privacy. So one of the ways to think about this in sort of everyday life is through the enactment of modesty. And I actually really love modesty because one of the things that you see is that people will go out of their way to try to deal with social situations that are awkward. Take the locker room, right? We can sit there a moment where we can be stripped naked and be very much visible to everybody. But you don't stare at somebody just because they're naked, right? That would be weird and creepy. So you avert your eyes, you try to pretend not to pay attention, except you're kind of noticing that that person's body is very different than yours. You look away, and there's all of these processes by which we negotiate this. Right? And you see this as a moment where the humans very much sort of go and think about themselves as ostriches. Right? They're trying not to pay attention, they're trying not to notice. And the funny thing is that we let people do this. Sociologist Irving Goffman talks about civil inattention, right? The ability to pretend like you're not paying attention, to let things happen. And civil inattention is a very important part of civil society. And this is one of the things that people think of New Yorkers as really rude because they're running around trying to pretend like they're not paying attention. Yet the moment that somebody falls on the street, I can guarantee you all of the New Yorkers will come and help that person up. Right? We're not paying attention until we are. We're aware of the things that are around us and not paying attention to them because it's socially polite. And that social politeness is extremely important. Of course, it's not surprising that we try to delude ourselves into believing that on Facebook we have a sense of privacy because we're doing a form of civil inattention. And yet there are all of these people and processes that are paying attention to us in entirely new ways. And those are factors of network privacy that we have to take into consideration. Right? We have a moment where we're dealing with an illusion of control. Illusion of control because we may be controlling through the technology our ability to see who within the particular group is paying attention, but we aren't thinking about Facebook employees, we aren't thinking about advertisers, we're very much thinking of our own world. So one of the reasons that I love dealing with teenagers, and I love dealing with teenagers, is they have very different ideas of what they're trying to do when they're dealing with it. In the case of privacy, they have very limited agency, not because of the technology companies or the governments or these types of things, but because of their parents. Right? Their parents think that they have the right to look in whenever they want. And this lack of agency means that young people are always trying to find a way to achieve privacy and find agency even when their parents don't want them to have it. And it's a beautiful process to watch as they try to navigate this. And what you see is that young people care deeply about privacy. But of course, what they're really worried about is their parents, law enforcement, teachers, college admissions officers. And they're not thinking more generally than that. The other thing I love about teenagers is that they don't automatically assume that what is normal in physical space should be normal online. And they do a great job of showing to me some of the things that are really radically different online. And one of the most important factors there is a radical shift from private by default to public by default. So what I mean by this is that when we interact in a physical environment, not when I'm on stage, but in a personal interaction, our conversations are private by default until you go out of your way to make it very public. Right? Private by default, public through effort. Online, it's radically different. What ends up happening is it becomes public by default, private through effort. And so what you have to look at to understand privacy online is the effort people go through to try to actually make sense of things. So in the last couple of years, I've watched a lot of young people try to assert control online and fail miserably. They're often out there screaming, keep out, I don't want you here, this is my space, in any various incarnations. And for the most part, they get ignored over and over again. And they find that that kind of assertion of control doesn't work. So we started to see them try to achieve fun strategies, try to achieve privacy through really innovative manners. When they try to do this online, they don't think necessarily about how they can lock down content, although some of them do. And there's two different ways of thinking about it. One is a set of structural strategies that young people take to try to assert privacy in these spaces, and one is a set of social strategies. I'm going to give you a couple examples. Hunter is a 14-year-old geeky boy that I met in Washington, D.C. And he manages multiple contexts on Facebook, and he really struggles with it. He goes to a school where education is highly valued, and he lives in a community where education is not. And he's dealing with this problem because his sister is friends with him on Facebook, and as Hunter puts it, she's really ghetto. And he really struggles with the fact that she keeps asserting certain norms onto Facebook that conflict with his friends. And so one of the places where he comes out for him is that he has this moment where he wants to talk about Legends of Zelda and Pokemon, which are the games that he's really, really into, but are not cool within his home community. So he goes through these ways of actually blocking out his cousins and his sister, segmenting a universe just to deal with being able to talk about Pokemon and Legends of Zelda. It's a very simple structural strategy, one we think of as the default within Facebook. Shamika has a very different strategy, and she's sort of interesting this way. She's also from DC. She has to deal with the fact that all of these people, particularly from the state, are looking in at her content online, and all of her friends at school are looking in and creating drama. She doesn't want people to see the past, so she engages in something that's talked about as whitewalling. And what that means is that on Facebook, she goes, and every time she reads a comment, she deletes it. Every time she leaves a comment on somebody's page, the next day, she deletes it. She tries to keep her Facebook as blank as possible. Another really hardcore structural strategy. Carmen, on the other hand, goes with a social strategy, trying to actually manage social norms. In her case, her mother is on Facebook, and she loves her mother there, but her mother always overreacts to anything that is remotely sort of sensitive or topical. When she broke up with her boyfriend, she wanted to sort of express that she was sad, but she knew if she did, her mother would think she was suicidal. So instead, she used song lyrics, because song lyrics are the ways in which you express yourself through encoded means. And she, knowing her friends were really sort of geeky and had just recently watched Monty Python's The Life of Brian, decided that they'd put up song lyrics to always look on the bright side of life. Now, if anybody's seen the film, you know that this is sung at the moment where Brian is about to be executed. Her mother, though, reads the lyrics literally and says, "It looks like you're doing really well." Her friends call her. So what happens in this sort of slight moment is really important because she's engaging in an act of social steganography. She's hiding in plain sight. Instead of controlling access to content, she's controlling access to meaning, right? And that in itself is an extremely important privacy strategy. Now, there are plenty of young people who are sort of looking out and trying to find and trying to invade each other's privacy, and not all of them are so innovative about what they're doing. But one of the things is just those 3 short clips, of which I have many more for you if you're curious about this, is the ways in which young people are actually showing that they care about privacy, and they're trying desperately to make it work within their community. They're trying desperately to assert a sense of privacy. So why should this matter to you, right? So young people, one, actually do care about privacy, no matter how many times business folks try to tell you that they don't. But they really care about who's looking, why they're looking, and how they're looking. For a lot of young people trying to innovate strategies for privacy, they're very much thinking about their parents. They're very much thinking about their communities around them. They're not thinking about corporations or governments. Why? Because they're outside of their purview of their reality. Right? And we actually have to think about what privacy means for them. When we actually get there, do we have a role of protecting them? What does it mean that they're revealing all of this information about people around them? And how do we actually have to deal with the sort of social dynamics about it? Because most of the times young people don't have a clue about all of the different things that are happening there. In some ways, one of the reasons I love this moment is that as we're having these privacy debates, we have the ability to help young people actually think through broader worlds of privacy and what it means for them. But the other thing is that our current model of privacy very much has this sort of individual-centric nature to it. And I'm really actually worried about that. Because our individual-centric nature of it, as young people are sort of innovating and trying to make sense of things, our individualism basically means that we're going to continue going down a path of trying to regulate around individual harm. We're going to try to regulate about the individual kids, not about the ways in which we think about them as a collective, not about the ways in which we think about them revealing information about one another, participating in an environment where they're sharing to be seen, but they're trying to protect themselves to not be seen by certain people. And when we think about what's going on with privacy and we think about what's going on with Facebook as it's blowing up, we need to really concern ourselves with finding solutions where we actually deal with the complexities of privacy. Because the privacy answers for the 2010s are not going to be the same as the privacy answers for the 1970s, even though those are the laws that are on the books, those are the laws that we're thinking about. Teenagers may be developing these sort of interesting, innovative strategies, and I love this, but it's not going to be about restricting access or restricting their data and their participation. One of the biggest concerns that I have about what's going on in the privacy debates is that we assume that we can limit the collection of data and solve our privacy problems, instead of thinking about all of the way in which we have to think about usage of data. We need to move beyond the individual and start thinking about it as a network puzzle, because we're all implicated in it. Thank you.